All right. I really, so I want to get to this Ecuador story. This is really important. And there's going to be a lot unfolding over this week and the next couple weeks, and then in going into the final elections that we're going to, be getting to on this show. But I basically want to set the framework today, but to I mean, we have this really funny story that I want to get to early on, but let me just sort of set the stage a little bit for folks who might not be familiar with Ecuador and what's sort of at stake right now. So there are elections that occurred very recently in Ecuador in their first round of their presidential election. It's a runoff system, so the first and second place vote getters are going to go into a final election, which will be held in April, right? Unless in the first round, one candidate receives, I believe, over 50% of the vote. Andres Arauz, who is a left-wing economist who is a former member of the Correa government, is by far the front runner. He won this first round of election by a significant margin, but not enough to avoid a runoff. So what's happening right now is there is still, as of recording today on Thursday, a pretty tight margin between two other candidates. And we'll get into those dynamics in a second. But I just wanted people to understand the context of the pink tide and the Correa government in Ecuador before we get into this story, which is very funny. Another very classic kind of psyop. We don't know who was behind it, but we wanted to get to that early. But just so people understand who Correa is and what the pink tide meant for Ecuador. I mean, for a long time, for people who are sort of new to this kind of thinking, to being socialists, people who weren't around basically when this was going on, the pink tide was an alliance, or was a phenomenon of left-wing, socialist, social democratic governments across Latin America. Lula da Silva, right? It was example of that. Evo Morales and Correa, right? Along with Hugo Chavez, as well as Maduro, right? This was an incredible moment in Latin America where you saw this coalition of left-wing governments coming into power and basically pushing back against the Washington consensus, the IMF consensus, and doing a lot of good for their people. So Rafael Correa was one of the major leaders of the pink tide. He was the leader of Ecuador. He doubled the minimum wage, cut poverty in half, and invested heavily in healthcare. He, like Lula and like Morales, faced what we're calling now a lawfare very recently. So this is somebody who is definitely not a friend of the U.S. State Department. He's definitely not a friend of the Latin America right wing, and he's somebody who is constantly maligned because of that. So Arauz is running in this election, coming in in this first round, and is being attacked and slimed with all these ridiculous accusations. But there's this really funny story, Matt, do we have this, about the discovery, basically trying to tie Andres Arauz into two kind of like super far left militant organizations in Colombia, right? Do you have this up?
I do, yep.
If you can read, I can't see it.
Okay, yeah, I'll put it up here 1 second. So yeah, the shrill Tina Moo bird becomes inadvertent whistleblower on fake propaganda video shared during Ecuador elections, and we'll go a little bit here to this clip here, and
para nuestros camaradas revolucionarios de la hermana de la República del Ecuador.
so
Mantenemos nuestra palabra de apoyar la lucha revolucionaria de los procesos progresistas en América Latina, por lo que continuará nuestro compromiso de asistir a la campaña política en Ecuador.
Now it says it's in Colombia. Now you won't, if you don't speak Spanish, you won't understand that. But what you will understand is the bird song behind it, and that was all that was needed for some ornithologists to determine that the the video was not, in fact, filmed in the Colombian jungle, but probably in Ecuador somewhere, where this bird is known to inhabit. So, I mean, shout out to the shrill tinamou bird for its solidarity, whistleblowing. Its habitat is under threat from climate change, of course. So I don't know. Hopefully, we can do it a solid and reverse that a little bit.
After they helped out. Yeah, and we bring this up because it's a very funny example, but this is just something that you're going to be seeing a lot of, right? Which is whenever you start to see attention in U.S. media, start getting pointed in the limited way that it does, to countries like Ecuador or Bolivia, you start to get a lot of wild stories, and it's just a good reminder to folks that there is just an incredible amount of misinformation and propaganda emanating from out of this election. So let me just I'm trying to think if I should let me set the stage a little bit to everybody about what this election means. So I talked a bit about Correa and what that had meant for working people in Ecuador. And again, look, these aren't perfect systems. Correa is not like, some kind of perfect prophet or anything like that, but very much represented a break with the IMF, very much represented a break with U.S. imperialism, very much represented pan-Latin American solidarity that was fighting for the working class, a group of people who have had, a boot around their neck for hundreds of years. You cannot talk about Latin America without understanding that South America in particular, obviously, though not to exclude Central America, has been defined by extraction by imperialist powers since Europeans appeared. Right? You need to understand that if you're going to understand why it's so important that we see these justice movements today. So Correa comes into power, and then after he leaves, he's succeeded by Lenin Moreno, who was in his government and was supposed to be one of his understudies.
And we should just say the name is Lenin Moreno. Do you want to comment on?
Yeah, and that is not an accident. He was named after the revolutionary communist Vladimir Lenin, which is just a tragic joke if you realize once you understand who this person is and what he ended up representing. But this was somebody, who was supposed to represent, a continuity of this government, not a break. That's how he came into power. People were like, okay, this will be a continuation of these programs. But almost immediately, he became a lapdog for the United States and the IMF. Heavily indebted the country to the IMF, took horrible loans that, of course, came with all the typical IMF stipulations of increased austerity and privatization and attack on workers' rights. Most notably, I think for Americans, or I guess anybody, but that people might be familiar with, is that Lenin Moreno evicted Julian Assange from the Ecuadorian embassy in the United Kingdom, essentially condemning Assange to state terror by the United States and the United Kingdom. Also, it should be noted that Moreno also turned his back on other pink tide leaders. He refused to let Evo Morales fly over Ecuador when Evo Morales was fleeing far-right Christian fascist violence, right? So that's what's been going on for the past few years, is increased austerity, increased power for the IMF, the destruction of the project of Correa, and just a push to privatize as much as possible. And just to paint the picture a little bit more clear to people about like the economy of Ecuador. Ecuador is around 17 million people. Its main industries are petroleum and food processing, textiles and wood products and chemicals. So oil is extremely important, and you have a state-owned majority in that, which is always a bad scenario if you, in the context of the United States and the IMF, who are always trying to come after those resources. So Moreno took horrible IMF loans, increased austerity, started privatizing parts of the central banking system, raised oil prices for people in Ecuador, which is, very damaging to folks. And he turned his back on on Correa and toward the United States and the IMF. So let me see. And so now let's talk about the other two people who were coming up against Arauz in this most recent election. Coming into this week, when they were counting the votes, and it's very, very close. I mean, I think we're somewhere around like 99% of the votes have been counted. Actually, sorry. It also needs to be noted that Moreno did everything that he could to prevent Correa or anybody associated with him participating in this election, right? So that includes banning political parties, trying to ban Arauz from running in the first place, anyone who basically had any association with Correa, basically just throwing out the book on any kind of democratic project. You need to understand the context of this election to understand what's going on here, right? This isn't just a normal, people show up and register to vote, people show up and declare themselves as candidates. This has been a fight to make sure that people are able to have their voice heard. So now we are at 99% of the votes totaled, and again, Correa's, somebody associated with Correa, Arauz looks like he's going to win out, and we'll talk a little bit more about his platform later. But now there is a very, very tight race between Yaku Perez, and who is an indigenous leader with some pretty interesting and suspicious positions, I must say so. But he is sort of being framed in the Western press as this kind of eco-socialist leader, and we'll get a little bit more into depth on that later. And he is basically neck and neck with Guillermo Lasso, who is an ex-Coca-Cola executive, a super wealthy businessman, somebody who is constantly running for office and for the presidency. Perez was actually up until I believe early today, but right now it is looking like it will be a runoff between Lasso and the Rose in the final election in April, right? So basically a continuation of a social democratic or socialist project in Ecuador versus far right IMF politics. And
yeah, how much do we want to get into Yaku Perez on this?
I definitely want to get into him. I just want to put the positive agenda up first.
Okay,
why we like Arauz, why we like the continuation of the Correa project. We were talking about the history of the country earlier. Arauz did a really great interview in Jacobin magazine, which we can post or put in the show notes or something maybe later. He's proposed, one, obviously dealing with the COVID crisis as soon as possible. He wants to give $1,000 to 1 million Ecuadorian families in their first week of government. It should also be noted that they use the U.S. dollar in Ecuador. And that proposal, by the way, it should also be noted that Perez, who people are now trying to portray as this, again, more left-wing candidate, like a lot of people in the U.S. are making this kind of statement, said that proposal would be a waste because those families would probably use that money to buy beer.
Which is honestly, there's a lot more in this Ben Norton Gray Zone piece on Perez, but that's all you need to really hear, right?
And there's more than the Norton piece out there too. There's a lot of other people who've been doing that reporting, but absolutely, that's definitely, should give you kind of implication as to where this person's standing on a lot of these issues. But Arauz also wants to repatriate money taken from the country. We're talking about places like Miami and Europe. We talk about a lot on this on this show about how big of an issue that is not being able to, one, control your own currency, but also to prevent people from just basically being able to extract all of the money out of the country whenever they please. So he wants to make sure that those kind of very wealthy people are forced to participate in the society they, allegedly are a part of. He wants to obviously fight for vaccination for frontline workers as soon as possible, which has already been a huge scandal, with high up government officials in the Moreno government getting it first. He wants to rebalance, societal roles between men and women. And he really, and this is why he's going to be such a threat and why you're going to see so much nonsense about him and the Correa project going forward. He opposes unipolarity, right? They want to continue to have relations with China and with Russia, and they want to fight for Latin American integration, right? Which again is a very positive program, but not a program that's going to be very positive to the United States State Department.
Yeah, just a note on Correa. There's this 2007 story in Reuters. Ecuador wants a military base in Miami, and this is because Correa said if you want to keep your base in Ecuador, then we get to open one on Miami, which is very funny position to put the U.S. government in. So, and that's one of his, anti-imperial policies. I read a book, The Ebb of the Pink Tide. It was a Pluto Press book, and it was written after when Moreno was in power. So, and Lula, I think, in prison, or like things weren't looking good for the Pink Tide broadly. And so this it's a little bit more skeptical of the Pink Tide treatment. But it's interesting the relationship that Correa had with the State Department, because he did this stuff and the Assange stuff also, but also had a police riot in 2010 that he literally, like, Hillary Clinton State Department had to come to his defense. And you see the why they want to escape unipolarity, or right, and have a more multipolar world, because you don't want to have to depend on Hillary Clinton to say, like, because it forced Correa into a position of saying, hey, we're not anti-imperialist, we're not anti-American, because all of a sudden, right? And I think, like, with this I guess the second wave of the Pink Tide coming in now, I think it's interesting to note these sorts of, like, ebbs and flows.
It's a lesson that Lula talks about. Like, Lula in his most recent interviews has said, like, we thought that we could work with the beast. Like, we thought that we could have some form of cordial relations with the United States, and avoid basically, being ostracized like Cuba is, right? Or like Venezuela is even, right? And he would, as we talk about a lot on TMBS and have continued to do so on this show, there is a clear line between the United States government and the lawfare against Lula. Right? They wanted to get him out of power. They were willing to wage, covert war against him, just like they were willing to do it in Bolivia, and just like we know that they are prepared to do it in the case of Ecuador. So what we are seeing from these Pink Tide leaders now is more and more comfort, and just understand that there really just isn't any other choice in the fight against U.S. imperialism.
And were you saying that Yaku Perez had basically the OAS line on different area coups?
That's what I want. Yeah, and that's what I wanted to get to as well. Right. I know there are, Perez. There are some people on the left who are anti-imperial. So I think sometimes their first reaction is to run to maybe the most conspiratorial sides on things, and I don't think that it's helpful when you have so much that is very clear. Perez, is running on a kind of, like, they use the word eco-socialist, but in my opinion, much more of a, just general, like, ecology, platforms, like ride your bicycle more, stuff like that. Avoid extractive industries, right? Which is all well and good if you're a country like the United States, but if you're a country that still very much is in development because they were purposefully underdeveloped, to just leave things in the ground is not necessarily the best solution. But dropping that argument aside, like, let's not even deal with that. Perez is somebody who has in the past worked against the Correa movement. So in 2017, he stood with the right wing of the country against Moreno. And even though we know who Moreno became, this was not some kind of principled, rejection of Moreno because he's like, oh, I think he's going to betray the left. It was because he was an extension of the left-wing project, right? And what we've already seen from other right-wing members, other right-wing people who have run for president, including Lasso, they have said that they will all align against Arauz in a general election, right? So there is a likelihood. We'll see what happens now, since it looks like he's not going to be the runner-up. If he joins again, but the history is very clear on that. And I would also just note a few other positions. Perez is somebody who said that, who celebrated Lula and Dilma's imprisonment, right? And said that he hopes the same thing happens in Ecuador. He is somebody who supported the coup against Evo Morales. He is somebody who said that he would sign a free trade agreement with the United States, somebody who said that he wouldn't work with China, right? It's just, it's don't get fooled by people who want to paint a picture without actually looking at the geopolitical realities of folks, right? Like, it's all well and good to like try to tell yourself a kind of story about people and to say like, wow, look, it looks like there's, kind of like indigenous, ecological warrior who's rising up for his country. But take a little bit of time and look at the platform and look at who they're aligning themselves with, when there is a very clear left alternative.
If they're rhyming with imperial structures, then that's not the leader you're looking for.
And I can't remember the Brazilian who said this, but there's a line that said, environmentalism without anti-capitalism is just gardening.
So I mean, that's pretty unfair to gardening. I kind of
gardening's good.
I have a little in, like,
but you got to get to the source of these things, right? And anyways, so this is, just a sort of introduction to what happens. It looks like there is going to be a very long campaign that's going to be going on for the next couple of months. We bring all of this up and some of the kind of funkier things, not to slime anybody, but to say there's already a lot of uncertainty about this election, right? There's already a lot of unease around it because there is the fear that people are going to, that they might start rejecting the results of the election, which only gives Moreno an opportunity maybe to extend his position. And before we end this segment, Matt, there's that last clip that I had of Andres Arauz, who again is the front runner, and hopefully will be the next leader of Ecuador, talking about some moves that we are seeing from Moreno to increase privatization in the country, increase privatization of the central bank in the last section of his presidency. Despite getting a very, very clear mandate that his tenure and his vision for the country is over.
Manifestamos nuestra abierta oposición a la ley de privatización del Banco Central que ha enviado el día de ayer el señor presidente saliente Lenín Moreno a pocos días de dejar su gobierno. No vamos a permitir que se apruebe una ley en donde contempla que los cargos que dejará él nombrados tengan un periodo más largo que la próxima administración de la presidencia de la República. Eso no es admisible. No es admisible que se quiera privatizar la gobernanza del Banco Central para que los banqueros puedan seguir en el ejercicio del poder independientemente de la voluntad democrática del pueblo ecuatoriano. Y finalmente, no vamos a permitir que dejen cambiada la normativa para que cuando llegue un gobierno soberano representativo de su pueblo no pueda modificar las normas relativas a la reestructuración de créditos. Por favor.
Yeah. And, for people who are listening, basically he's saying that they're not going to allow the Moreno government, again, who is not running because he has literally no approval because he has failed as a president and basically turned the country, into an open garage sale to the IMF and Western powers. That they are not going to allow him to continue this program in the waning time, in the waning part of his presidency. I know we've gone for a while, Matt, but there's something I want to actually include as part of this segment too. Mm-hmm. These last two stories, because I want to remind people of the stakes, right? It's the section called Justice in Bolivia and Brazil. Because one thing, the reason that we're coming in hard about this, we want people to understand what's happening there, and we are, not indulging in a kind of fantasy that like, okay, yeah, we support, Arauz, coming into power, but also it's so fine and dandy that he's getting challenged from the left, maybe, right? We are coming in hard about this because people need to understand how high the stakes are, right? And these two stories about hopefully justice being seen, right, should remind people of just what the right wing is capable of in this part of the world. So we have this first one up here. So this is a hopeful story. These are two hopeful stories in the wake of absolute tragedy. So in the first story, in Bolivia, after we saw this horrendous coup, and a coup that was defeated by the people, by the social movements, despite U.S. backing, despite support from American liberal media all across the board, the people were victorious. It still saw serious violence. And retired General Luis Valverde is being charged for being responsible in the Sencata massacre, which took place a week after the coup against President Evo Morales in 2019. I think people might have forgotten the horrible scenes that we were seeing after the coup in Bolivia. Just disgusting. And the fact that there's still people who have jobs in commentary at respected institutions who have not had to have any repercussions for their support of this coup is disgusting.
Who are applauding it as a victory for democracy.
Yes. But this is just and is correct and is right that the people involved should be, tried and held accountable for this. So that is, a reminder of what happened in Bolivia, and is again, something that we've said, with Morales and, with Morales basically being back in the social movements, being back involved with the fight for the people, and Luis Arce, reinvigorating MAS. There will have to be massive reshufflings of the state apparatus and the military. So that's an encouraging sign that they are doing that. And in Brazil, in the wake of far-right violence, right, again, supported by the United States, continued destabilization of the country, first with their involvement against Dilma Rousseff, and then in their unjust imprisonment of Lula da Silva, right, through lawfare, with very willing participants from the Brazilian state and the Brazilian judiciary in the service, and with the serious help of the United States FBI. The serious far-right violence, and one of the casualties of that was Marielle Franco, who was a visionary socialist leader, who was brutally gunned down in the street by people who have very close ties, by the way, to Bolsonaro and the Bolsonaro family at large. But a Brazilian court will now try Marielle Franco's murderers. You could scroll down a little bit, Matt. I guess hold on one second, y'all. Basically, I want to make sure I get everybody's name right. The Rio de Janeiro Justice Court on Tuesday confirmed that a court will try former police officer Rani Lessa and former military officer Eliseo Queiroz, both of whom are charged with the murder of Socialism and Liberty Party PSOL Councilwoman Marielle Franco and her driver Anderson Gomez. It's not enough of a reckoning for what's happened in that country, and the inclusion of the police force and the far-right militias in that kind of terror, but it is a step in the right direction to fight for justice and for healing. And
just one detail here: Franco's murder occurred on the night of March 14, 2018 in Rio. Her vehicle was shot 13 times by an HK MP5 submachine gun, a high-precision weapon used only by elite police forces.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And this is the thing: is the stakes are just extremely, extremely high, and you just can't play around with this stuff, and you just can't indulge fantasy on this kind of thing. So solidarity with everybody there. Really, really, a hopeful moment. I mean, hopefully, we should take from this, rather than fixating on the pitfalls, is the people are rising up, and there could be a serious return to pink tide governments all across Latin America, which is a hopeful thing for the world.
I mean, that's the thing, is like, you look at Central and South America, and the reaction to neoliberalism was well underway before 2008. Like, and include like Correa. I don't know the names of the guys, but it was people nominally against neoliberal policy, and then once they got into power, they did what Lenin Moreno did, and you revert to actually just doing whatever the IMF says. But it is like where we need to take the cues from, especially like the fight against neoliberalism globally, because it's just much more evolved there. It seems like.